Hello viewers and learners, Namaste. In the series of international relations theory, I was discussing dependency theory in international relations. I have divided that into two parts. So in the first part we discussed the definitional side and the historical side of dependency theory. Now we'll discuss the dependency relationship and some of its core assumptions in present times. So now we are going to discuss about the dependency relationship. So how that dependency relationship actually works and what is the nature of this dependency relationships. So here the first thing that can be said about this dependency relationship is the capitalist system, it has enforced a rigid international division of labor which is responsible for the underdevelopment of many areas of the world. Now this thing is very important here that because of the global capitalist system, a rigid international division of labor, it has been enforced. Now this rigid international division of labor determines the economic activities in dependent countries, right? So what all are going to be the economic activities? What will they do? Whether they are going to be the manufacturing economies or they will continue to supply raw materials, what is going to be the nature of their imports, what kind of technologies they are going to use, right? And from where the investments will come. All these things also directly have an impact on the economic productive side of dependent countries. Second important thing is the dependent states supply cheap materials, agricultural commodities and cheap labor, and also serve as the repositories of surplus capital, obsolescent technologies and manufactured goods. So if you see the economic activities in dependent countries, then what they do, they largely supply cheap materials, right? They supply raw materials, they supply agricultural commodities, and they also provide cheap labor to international market. Apart from that, the surplus capital which is there with dominant states, which is there with developed countries, so they invest that surplus capital in dependent states to further earn some more profits. Technologies which became obsolete in Western societies or in developed countries, they were exported to developing countries and further they help them generate more profits. Apart from that, the dependent countries, they largely remain dependent on imports because they rarely manufacture products what they consume. So for manufactured goods, they remain dependent again on the dominant states or the core countries. Third important thing regarding this relationship is that all these functions, they orient the economies of the dependent states towards the outside money, goods and services do flow into the dependent states, but the allocation of resources is determined by the economic interest of the dominant states. So basically the argument here is that if we see the dominant dependent relationships between states, then it doesn't mean that in dependent states there were no economic activities at all. They get the money from outside, they get the goods, manufactured goods from outsides, they also receive certain services, they also use certain technologies which are supplied by some dominant country, some rich country. But the interesting thing is that here again the relationship or the use of all these things or the terms and conditions of using all those things, they are determined by the economic interest of the dominant states, not by the economic requirements, needs or interest of the dependent countries. And that is the reason that economic interest of dependent countries, it continue to get neglected and they remain poor. Fourth important thing in this relationship is that this division of labor is ultimately the explanation for poverty in dependent countries. We cannot, blame the dependent countries that they are poor because they were less hardworking or because they were not having very good education system or because they have liberalized their economies late, or because their leadership is corrupt, or because they lack the required skills, etc. No, that is not the sole. These are not the sole reasons, right? The primary reason for this is the international division of labor. So, because of this international division of labor, the economic activity in dependent countries is not within the control of those states. So, when the economic activity is dominated by somebody else, how it can serve the economic interest of that state? Now, there is another important side of dependency theory. In the previous lecture also I have discussed that dependency theory and what kind of relationship it has with Marxism. To a large extent, the dependency model rests upon the assumption that economic and political power are heavily concentrated and centralized in the industrialized countries. This core assumption of dependency theory that they are having, they share it with Marxist theories of imperialism. But here it is important to note that not all dependency theorists are Marxist, and one should clearly distinguish between dependency and a theory of imperialism so that we can differentiate the nature and the basic meaning and connotation of dependency theory and Marxism. The first important distinction is the Marxist theory of imperialism explains dominant state expansion, while the dependency theory explains underdevelopment. So, Marxist theory primarily focused on how the dominant state continued to grow, how they have expanded, what strategies they have adopted, right? Which wars they have fought, how they fought those wars, how they have won those wars. On the other hand, when we talk about dependency theory, it primarily focuses on underdevelopment or the conditions, historical conditions responsible for that underdevelopment. In other words, Marxist theories explain the reasons why imperialism occurs. What is the guiding force or objective behind imperialism? While dependency theories, they try to explain the consequences of imperialism. So, dependency relationship or dependent position or poorer conditions of certain states, it is actually a consequence of imperialism, right? So, here there is a distinction between the core arguments of Marxist theory regarding imperialism and what is the opinion about what is the opinion of dependency theorists regarding underdevelopment, which is an offshoot effect of imperialism. The second important thing is the Marxist theory of imperialism is self-liquidating, while the dependent relationship is self-perpetuating. So this is interesting, again important here. So Marxist theory of imperialism believe that it is self-liquidating. It means that at one point of time there will come a saturation point, right? And imperialism will lead to more frequent wars, more frequent competition, which play an important role in the destruction of the very ideology which is acting, working on behalf of imperialism. The end of imperialism in the Leninist framework comes about as the dominant powers go to war over a rapidly shrinking number of exploitable opportunities. So we can understand this point also in the context of First and Second World Wars. So all the imperial countries, they were actually competing for their economic interest, for more power, right, for more gains through exploitation. And Lenin believed that this imperialism, it may be the last stage of global capitalism. A dependency theorist reject this particular proposition. A dependent relationship, according to them, it exists irrespective of the specific identity of the dominant state. So who's dominating, it doesn't matter. But the nature of dependency, it always persists. So irrespective of which country is dominated at what particular point of time is immaterial as long as the division of state between dominant and dependent persists. To a dependency theorist, the central characteristics of the global economy is the persistence of poverty throughout the entire modern period in virtually the same areas of the world, regardless of what state was in control. So this relationship between developed and underdeveloping countries, or the relationship between dominant and dependent countries, it is continuing and it is self-perpetuating. It means that it is not going to end, irrespective of that the phase of colonialism has ended in a way. So now there is a phase of economic colonialism where you try to dominate certain countries by controlling their economies or influencing their economic decisions. But irrespective of this thing, dependent relationship is still continuing. So it is self-perpetuating, it keeps on continuing. There might be some changes in terms of who is dominating, but the domination thing always remains there. Third important thing is that there are some dependency theorists who do not identify capitalism as the motive force behind a dependent relationship. Now here some of the scholars in relating to dependency school, they disagree that we can completely blame capitalism for this dependent relationship, and they argue that the relationship is actually maintained by a system of power first, and it does not seem as if power is the only supported by capitalism. So their core argument is that at the international level there is also a system of power. So some countries are more powerful, and power is not just economic in nature, or power is not something which is only related to capitalism, right? So there can be different forms of power. So certain countries are military power. So historically, if we see the relationship or the historical trajectory of state, then we'll understand this particular point better. They have also given an example. For example, in dependency relationship in socialist countries or in capitalist bloc during the Cold War period, still dependency relationship exists. So here there was a bloc where countries they are seen as one, or they are seen as part of the common bloc like the socialist bloc. But even within the socialist bloc, countries like USSR, they were the dominant ones, and other countries of say Eastern Europe, they are the dependent ones, or they can even be called as satellites. Now there are certain key propositions of dependency theory. These key propositions, or with the help of these key propositions, we can understand this dependency theory better. So what are these key propositions? The first one is that underdevelopment is a condition which is fundamentally different from undevelopment. So here we need to differentiate between these two terms, underdevelopment and undevelopment. So when we talk about underdevelopment, it means that you are putting your best efforts, you are using all your resources, all your skills, right? You want to achieve the goal of development, yet somehow you are not able to do that. On the other hand, if we talk about undevelopment, it has altogether a different meanings, right? It means that you are not willing to develop yourself, or you are not capable of utilizing your own resources. The later term simply refers to a condition in which resources are not being used. Underdevelopment refers to a situation in which resources are being actively used, but used in a way which benefits dominant states and not the poorer states in which the resources are found. So this is the basic difference between underdevelopment and undevelopment. When we say that underdevelopment is there, and because of this underdevelopment the certain countries are poor, so we need to understand what leads to that underdevelopment. The second key proposition of dependency theory is the distinction between underdevelopment and underdevelopment. It places the poorer countries of the world in a profoundly different historical context. The poor countries are not poor because they lag behind in the scientific transformation or the enlightened values of the European states. It means that when you historically try to analyze the position or the conditions of undevelopment and underdevelopment in case of poorer countries, you will find out that it is not because of their own faults as such. It is not because of the reason that they have started economic liberalization late, or they have started dealing with international community late, or they have started international trade late, right? Or they lack scientific transformation, which started primarily in Europe, or they lack industrial revolution or enlightenment values, which was the basis of industrial revolution too. Right? So these were not the primary reasons. Rather, they are poor because they were coercively integrated into the European economic system only as producers of raw materials or to serve as repositories of cheap labor, and were denied the very opportunity to market their resources in any way that competed with dominant states. So the primary reason here is that the poorer countries, they were actually forced and they were integrated in the European economic system. That relationship is not mutual, it was not based on mutual interest, right? Rather, they were forced. And they were also forced to provide raw materials only, or to provide cheap labor only. They were not allowed to innovate in their economies so that they can perform better. They were not allowed to industrialize their economies, right? They were not allowed to develop latest technologies. And that is the reason that and even when you have to sell your raw materials in international market, you have to do that according to the terms and conditions which are decided by the developed countries. So colonialism here can be taken as a very good example of this kind of relationships. So how the colonial powers, they have enforced colonial economic structures in their colonies, and how they have destroyed their local economies and changed the entire direction and nature of their local economies in tune to the interest of their own economies. Third core assumption of dependency theory is that dependency theorists, they suggest that alternative uses of resources are preferable to the resource uses patterns which are imposed by dominant countries. So here there is a suggestion that dependency theorists, they have floated. They have argued that the dependent countries, they should try to explore more towards like finding some alternative uses of the resources. So rather than selling the resources in the international markets at the terms and conditions that are decided by dominant states at a cheaper price, right? They should sell it in either say competitive markets, or they should innovate so that those resources can be utilized, right? They can be utilized better. In the present conditions of globalization, to a certain extent we can argue that because of globalization, now market access is open even for dependent states. So now they can sell their raw materials, and there is a competition among the takers. So whenever a resource became scarce, competition is bound to happen among the takers. And this is what that happens in international economic market, right? Which is helping some dependent states. The fourth core assumption of dependency theory is that national economic interests should be given priority by dependent countries. So rather than giving importance to the kind of relationship that they are having with dominant countries, or rather than serving the interest of dominant states, helping their companies out, prosper their economies, they should identify their own national economic interest. When they argue that dependent countries, they should focus on their own national economic interest, they came closer to realism, because realist scholars also argue that it is the national interest that is important for every state in international relations. So every country, it should try to pursue its national interest, no matter what international law suggests, or no matter what, say, international treaties or international community or world public opinion or international morality mandates. So every country, it should secure further its national interest. In case of dependency theory, they argue that this national economic interest should be pursued. Now, this is also important to note here. The dependency theorists, they have not articulated an operational definition of the national economic interest. So they have argued that national economic interest should be identified, but they did not give a kind of operational definition so that it became easy for certain states to understand what exactly can be defined or explained as national economic interest of a state. The fifth important characteristic or the core assumption of dependency theorist is the diversion of resources over a period of time is maintained not only by the power of dominant states but also through the power of elites in the dependent states. Now, this point is very interesting. In developing and underdeveloping countries or in dependent states, generally the argument is that they are not able to develop themselves because of some rich and powerful countries in the international system. But in reality, there is a class within those dependent states, right? You may call them the elites of their societies. So those elites also obstruct the path of their economic development. Dependency theorists, they argue that these elites, they maintain a dependent relationship because of their own private interest, and their own private interest, they coincides with the interest of the dominant states. So in a way, we can understand it in this sense that the elite class of a dependent country, they develop such kind of interest which are in tune to the interest of dominant countries, and rather than acting positively in the interest of their own states, they end up serving the interest of dominant states. These elites are typically trained in the dominant states and share similar values and culture with the elites. So here we can say that those people who goes outside, right, abroad, studied there, or get their degrees in management from some foreign university, so they carry those values, right, and when they get back to their own countries, they pursue those values, and ultimately those values or that kind of training, academic training or management training, it helps the dominant states again. If we see this from another angle, then it can be argued that this kind of dependency relationship is actually a voluntary relationship, wherein a section of society in dependent countries is actually actively pursuing, supporting, furthering the interest of dominant states. Now, what is the significance or policy implications of dependency theory? Like all other theories, there are certain limitations also of the dependency theory. There are certain unanswerable questions, right? And there are scholars, those who have also criticizes the very premises of dependency theories, but still it holds a lot of significance and it has a lot of policy implications in international relations. The first one is the success of the advanced industrial economies does not serve as a model for the currently developing economies. So the Western countries actually, they have in a way convinced the entire international community that there is a unilateral path of development, or say industrial development. It means that the path that has been largely followed by developed countries, that is to be followed also by developing and underdeveloping countries if they want to develop their economies. There are no options here. They can't do anything else, right? They are totally dependent to integrate their economies or to agree on the terms and conditions which are actually introduced by them. So the main argument or the basic argument here is that advanced industrial economies, they cannot act as a model. So developing economies, they have altogether different kind of requirements. In fact, this thing can also be argued that developing economies and underdeveloping economies, they are not able to improve themselves or improve their economic output because of the conditions or because of the path, capitalist path that has been introduced by certain dominant states. The second important significance or policy implication of dependency theory is that dependency theory, it repudiates the central distributive mechanism of the new classical model, what is usually called trickle-down economies or trickle-down economics. So in the trickle-down economics, they argue that overall, when economic activities increases around the world between states, right, between even rich states and poorer states and mid-level states, developing, underdeveloping, and developed countries, then it will have a trickle-down impact. It means gradually, when international economy will grow, all the countries which are part of that international economies, they will get the benefit of it. This assumption may be valid for a well-integrated, economically fluid economy where people can quickly adjust to economic changes and where consumption patterns are not distorted by non-economic forces such as racial, ethnic, and gender bias. So here we may argue this thing that this kind of thing can function in case of certain economies, right, which have some similarities with developed countries. But these conditions are actually not pervasive in the developing economies. For these structured reasons, dependency theorists argue that the market alone is not a sufficient distributive mechanism. Another important thing is that since market only rewards productivity, dependency theorists discount aggregate measures of economic growth such as the GDP or free trade index. Dependency theorists do not deny that economic activity occurs within a dependent states, but they do make a very important distinction that there is a difference between economic growth and economic development. So they want a balance between economic growth and economic development. The next important relevance or significance is that dependent states therefore should attempt to pursue policy of self-reliance. Contrary to the new classical models endorsed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which talks about greater integration into global economy, it is not going to be a very good choice for poorer countries. And that is the reason dependency theorists, they argue that dependent countries, they should try to become more self-reliant. We can also somehow relate it to the current Indian emphasis in Indian economy, like a self-reliant economy or an Atmanirbhar Bharat. This can be a guiding force, or India may here can set an example for other developing and underdeveloping economies, what actually they should do to deal with their dependency relationship or dependency status. Thank you.